Hi, and welcome everybody. We have an amazing episode ahead of Let's Talk About It, our segment on having courageous conversations around topics that might be a little bit challenging or just create some uncertainty around how to have these conversations. So we decided, let's just do it. Let's just talk about it and invite great people to talk with us on these topics together. Today, I'm super excited to talk with Christiana Bukalo on the topics of the privileges around national identity and freedom of movement and self-care for activists, which are huge. I'm sure that we'll just kind of scratch the surface a little bit, but I'm also really excited that we can give the space and spotlight these topics because I think they're super important and they don't receive enough attention thus far. Just to give you a little bit of context, Christiana and I met a little bit over a year ago when she was working as diversity and sustainability manager at the streaming startup Join in Germany. And we have sort of stayed in contact throughout some transitions within her life. And now Christiana, I think not too long ago, but please correct me if I'm wrong there, has founded an amazing community for stateless persons called Statefree. And I'm super, super happy to see the fruition of this and the birth of this community. And I think it really kind of creates a space of belonging for people who so long haven't had the chance to feel a sense of belonging. And because co-creating belonging is at the core and at the center of the work that we do at Dr. Leah Consulting, I'm beyond excited for this. So I'm your biggest fan, and I'm super excited to sort of jump in and talk a little bit about Statefree, about statelessness, and what national identity and statelessness have to do with each other and how that affects freedom of movement. Yeah, but maybe before we jump in, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself. And because I know that when I get asked to introduce myself, I'm always like, oh goodness, where do I start? What do I say? How long do I have?
Oh, yeah.
So, if you want, I thought I would give you the prompt to introduce yourself as you would introduce yourself to the 10-year-old you.
Wow. That's a good prompt and also challenging. So, yeah, first of all, hello, everyone. And I'm super excited to be part of this. Introducing myself to my 10-year-old self, or in that context, I would say that my name is Christiana. I am at the core a human being, I would say, who was born in Germany and since then has been affected by the challenge of not having a nationality. And that means that I am a stateless individual. Apart from that, I would say I am a person who loves change. So I like to refer to myself as a change maker. I think that is because I just simply draw energy and excitement from areas and environments in which change and innovation, although I don't know if my 10-year-old self knows that term, but maybe she had a sense for it, a feeling for it. So I love those environments in which that is not only allowed, but actually kind of required to work towards a higher vision that is just more fun and more enjoyable to anyone. And yeah, I would say change and innovation are also two things that are very much needed in this area of statelessness. And a few months ago, a year ago, actually, I have decided to, in that area, also follow my urge to change something. And that now makes me the founder of Statefree, as you already mentioned. And as a nonprofit organization, we are just focusing and working on our mission to bring people together in a digital space. So we are creating a platform which is supposed to help people connect to each other, to other stateless people, but also to people who are working on the topic, in order to build a bridge and allow them to experience community, experience belonging, and empowerment in that sense. And I guess as a 10-year-old self, I know actually that I wasn't even aware of the fact that I'm stateless, but I guess we might dig into that in the next couple of minutes anyways. But I would say that I had a sense or a feeling for the fact that something was different. And with Statefree, I guess our goal is that 10-year-old people who are at the age of 10, that they don't feel different just because they don't have a nationality.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. There's already so much in there that we could and we will unpack some of it together for sure. I just want to say that we will definitely also be dropping the link to Statefree in the show notes and everything. So please do go and check that out and see how and if you can support Christiana and the mission of Statefree yourself. Before unpacking everything and getting more deeper into the topic, what I wanted to do was actually read a poem. And the poem is called I'm Human, which already is an amazing title, I think. It's also the title of the UNHCR report on the situation of stateless persons in the UK that was published in April of this year of 2021. And the reason why I wanted to start with it was because it really touched me in my research and preparation for this episode, but also because, more broadly speaking, I really feel that in spaces, whether that's the workplace or looking at creating change in society from different angles than the workplace, art and works of art have such a huge role to play and are deeply underutilized, right? We have, I don't know, blogs and articles and books and scientific works and studies and things. But I think there is a balance that is missing a little bit, and art is such a powerful way of carrying through human experience, which is what we need to be in contact with, right? When really understanding how to create change and create innovation, as you just mentioned. So I'm super happy to have found this poem, and I just want to share it with you and with everybody who is listening to us.
Christiana found a video of the artist Raymond Santa Maria reading his poem. Since we want to let the artist's voice shine, we decided to cut the section of Fra reading his poem. We encourage you to listen to Raymond reading his poem, I'm Human, using the link in the show notes.
I feel like I want to say amen.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I really wish I could have had the person who wrote the poem read it and not me. There is definitely a part of me speaking about having conversations and not really knowing what the right way is to have them, right? There's a part of me that feels it's wrong for me to read this poem, but I'm super happy that it exists and that I came across it. And I would definitely recommend everybody to go and check out this report. And the poem was written by one of the people who was interviewed for the making of the report. Yeah, we're human. And I love that the final part of the poem, there's a sliver of hope somehow that comes in, right? And there's a question that I just kind of recently learned from Krista Tippett, who is an amazing question asker. And she sort of gives this question as an invitation to have great conversations. And the question is, what gives you hope? So I thought with the sliver of hope that is at the end of this poem, maybe we can start by you answering this question. What gives you hope right now?
I love that question. And I also love Krista Tippett. And I guess, so it might sound cheesy, at least it feels cheesy to me, but that's only because I think it's beautiful and it's just very much true. In my case, I feel like I draw 90% or rather 99% of my hope and energy and sense of purpose from the realization that the only reason I'm here are my parents and all the effort they put into pursuing this goal of making sure that I would be able to live in an environment in which I have the opportunity to do things that they weren't able to do. And if I look at how far they have come, but also maybe how far we as a family have come, when I think about what our circumstances were when I was a kid, like growing up in asylum home and so forth, and then moving into our first flat, and then looking at my own flat right now, a couple of years later, and it just makes me realize how much is possible, even despite all of the obstacles we are still facing, and that just gives me hope.
That's great. Amazing. Yeah, I think there's something really powerful about connecting to those who brought us where we are today, right? Whatever that might be. It's if it's biological family or chosen
Yeah.
family or other circumstances. Like I can very much relate to this sense of being part of a lineage in a way. So let's maybe dive a little bit into Germany, the situation in Germany, and also the kind of context that we're coming from as Dr. Mega Consulting in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging landscape, right? If I look at the work that I've done and also the research that I've done in this realm and look at how things have changed, how the landscape has changed over the last couple of years, I still feel like Germany, in my view right now, has still a very narrow view of what diversity, equity, and inclusion can look like, right? There's topics of sort of gender diversity, but oftentimes very, very specifically around female empowerment, and even more specifically around the empowerment of cisgendered heterosexual females, right? That are very dominant in the landscape, followed by maybe some reckoning with unconscious biases as like the number one training that is kind of asked for in this landscape. Oftentimes, unfortunately, sort of as the end all be all. And then maybe a little bit of a sprinkling of disability advocacy also related to sort of the German legal landscape and some advocacy around queer rights and queer inclusion. But surprisingly, I mean, even within these spaces, we could already be talking about nationality, right? We could be talking about freedom of movement and how do they intersect with these things that we're talking about. The situation of women of color, for example, the situation of queer refugees, which is a different form of marginalization that needs a different way of interacting with it, right? Issues of statelessness, I don't think I've really heard come up very much at all in this discussion. So I would be curious to hear your view, why you think statelessness, national identity, freedom of movement as topics don't really exist in this space where they really should be addressed.
Well, I think there are many reasons for that, and actually also very different perspectives, probably. I think one of the main reasons, probably also in the workplace, is simply that there is a huge lack of knowledge and public awareness about the topic. I have actually, especially before starting the work with Statefree, I have just never met anyone who knew about statelessness before I explained it to them. And I only started explaining it a few months ago. So prior to that, I almost kind of kept it a secret almost, because I knew it was something that would trigger a long conversation that would make me uncomfortable. Uncomfortable because it would again be a situation which I would have to explain that I'm not only different because I might have a different skin color than the person I'm talking to, but also because of other things. And also because I, as a person who experienced it, didn't even feel knowledgeable enough to talk about it. And so on the one hand, there's this lack of awareness and this belief that having a nationality is just a given, but it's not. It's a privilege, actually. And that's just very hard to understand because it's never communicated. So I completely understand. Then on the other hand, for those who know something maybe about the topic or might have heard about it, it's so complex that it's super hard to actually sometimes even dare to explain it, and maybe also dare to think about how one could make sure that people who are affected by it feel included, because it is hard to grasp for somebody who is not affected by it. And I guess in the workplace, because it kind of scratches on topics that maybe don't have to intersect too much with what we do at work. It is rather personal, to some extent at least. And I guess those are some of the reasons why it's not addressed in that space. But I do believe that especially experts in that area and the practitioners in that sense would be willing to integrate it into the work if they knew about it.
Yeah, I think so too. And it almost feels as though there's like a vicious cycle here, right? Of like there's a lack of awareness and a possible willingness, but because of the lack of awareness, the willingness isn't able to sort of really grip, right? And then we're sort of perpetuating this problem of non-existence of these conversations, right?
Yeah. And I was in the middle of that vicious circle because I Whenever when I started Statefree, I was oftentimes asked about statelessness, but also about my own story. And I was in this torn situation, which I didn't even know, do I even want to share something about myself, or do I actually want to focus on statelessness as such? So I was kind of silencing myself even, although I was the one trying to make sure that people know about the topic and that people become aware of it so that we can change something. So it's very hard also for oneself to step out of that circle, because it is important to assess whether or not you want, as an affected person, you want this topic to now even take up a larger space in your life than it does anyways. So yes, it is a huge vicious circle, and it's a very powerful one.
Yeah, and I think you touched a really important topic here that I want to give a little bit more attention to a bit later on. This, what does it mean, right? Like, what does it mean to be a person who is affected by an issue and also vocal and in some ways an activist in the same area, right? And therefore having mental load and emotional load and physical load that comes up at the intersection of both of these things. I think that's something that's really, really important to keep in mind as well, especially, again, coming back to the sort of the DEI space, where so often we are expecting people who are targets of oppression to be the educators on top of being the people who are experiencing the oppression, right? And I think that is one of the biggest injustices and cycles that we need to break of injustice, and we have a chance of breaking inside of the workplace, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if there is a shift or has been a shift inside of your own journey with this topic, because you said you were yourself in this vicious cycle of not knowing, do I explain what statelessness is, or do I talk about my own story, and how much of my own story do I want to share? So where are you right now on that journey?
Ooh, very good question. Oh, I think so. That journey kind of changes every day, to be honest. Currently, I would say that I'm trying to let go, meaning letting go of what I think I wanted to do and where I thought my life would lead me, because it was definitely not statelessness. I was not convinced of a certain goal, but if somebody would have asked me like 2 years ago whether I would at some point work on statelessness, I wouldn't even know. So currently, I am trying to balance those two things actually, because I think both make sense. I get, and I would probably feel the same if I wasn't affected by it. I totally understand that it's important to understand a individual story or hear an individual story to have the opportunity to kind of feel some empathy for what that person is going through. And it's also important to, in addition to that, share just facts about statelessness, because it is a highly complex topic, but it's something that is created by human beings. So it's important to be aware about that construct or of that construct, and to understand that this is nothing this is something we can solve. So it's not unsolvable, and it's very unfortunate, of course, and it's a political issue and it's a human rights issue, but it's also my personal issue. So it does make sense to combine all of those things, and I just need to make sure that for me, joy is just very important. It's just very important because that's like the only reason why we're here, right? Hopefully. So I just try to make sure that when working on the topic, I just have some aspects in which I can feel connected to my inner self. And that is just a person that is at the core extremely positive despite circumstances. So I just try to make sure that I have something to laugh about. Of course, not about statelessness, right? But about things that happen in my surroundings. So that's how I'm trying to balance those different aspects currently.
Amazing. Yeah. I think joy is a really great sort of keyword here as well. We actually just published a little infographic on creating moments of joy in your life to sustain the work of change.
Yeah.
Because we, as you say, right, we know that in order to continue on this journey, not burn out doing it, having moments of joy are super important. And that doesn't relativize how heavy these topics are, right? It's about the complexity of the human experience, which unfortunately or fortunately means that we have multiple emotions at the same time, and it's possible to hold all of those together. Yeah. So I wonder if people don't know what statelessness is, before we keep going talking about a topic and not ever defining it.
Yeah.
Maybe let's just take a little moment to do so, if that's okay with you. I know that, again, this is you being asked to define this, but it might be helpful for listeners.
And meanwhile, I'm embracing that. I'm just seeing it as an opportunity that I have the chance to explain it. I was just thinking about how much I want to go into depth. So, statelessness means that a person is not recognized as a citizen by any nation. So that means that that person doesn't have any citizenship and therefore no nationality. It is important to note that statelessness is something that is to be recognized, unfortunately, also by governance. And that makes it extremely complex, because there is, so if we look at all of the people who don't have a nationality, there are a lot of people who don't have a nationality. And then there are some people who don't have a nationality, but unfortunately that is not recognized. And those people end up having an unclarified status and an unclarified citizenship. But then there are people who are recognized as status people, and those are just stateless. I have to say, in our work, we just address all of those people as status people, because we think it doesn't make sense to split. In both cases, they don't have a nationality. And the main issue with statelessness is that it unfortunately limits access to basic human rights. So it depends on the country you live in, and it depends on how the government actually interacts with the concept of nationality. But there are cases in which stateless people can't go to school, in which they are not able to work, in which they don't have access to public health system, which is just, if you look at the pandemic we are in, it's just crazy. And that all of those things are tied to a nationality. So unfortunately, as a stateless person, you oftentimes don't have the ability to actually move around, which means that you're not allowed to travel because you just don't have the documents needed for that. And also you're not able to vote. And so all of those things end resulting in complete marginalization and exclusion from society. In some cases, you have lived in ever since because you weren't able to go anywhere else. So you are part of a certain group, but you're never really part of it because you just get rejected from time and time again. So that's statelessness in a nutshell, if we want to put it that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just recently learned that statelessness actually affects more than 10 million people worldwide. So if people think that, this is just a small issue, it's not. There are so many people who are affected by statelessness for various reasons, and all of them through no fault of their own, right? Which I think is, again, also something that's really important to recognize. As you said, it's a human-made issue that can be changed by us. And I believe there was even kind of a push to end statelessness by 2024. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm just thinking now it was kind of pulled until 2030. Yeah, so it's a huge goal. I do see the intention of it, but I have to admit that I am skeptical, not only because of the time frame as such, actually, because of course pressure is needed, and there is a reason for making those kind of goals and those kind of statements, just to also emphasize how important it is to do something right now, because if not, we would even act slower. So I do understand that. But then again, I'm also oftentimes torn between this goal of ending statelessness versus making sure that stateless people are simply included. Because ending statelessness means that everyone needs to have a nationality, because that is important for us to access certain things. I'm not so sure about that, because I just struggle to understand why a nationality should determine whether or not somebody is allowed to go to school, and whether or not somebody is allowed to get married. And out of my perspective, I would actually like to see a world in which it's just not an issue that I'm stateless. because I don't pose any harm to anyone. I'm just living my life, and maybe it's okay for myself. Like for me, I have to admit that meanwhile, I identify extremely with the term of statelessness. And I would be okay with being stateless as long as it wouldn't mean that I have less access to rights in comparison to other people.
I think that is a super important distinction. And I think it's actually shared by different forms of marginalization as well, right? It's so often the thing we're struggling with is that we're being held back from accessing power, accessing resources, accessing human dignity, being treated with respect and being welcomed, right? But unfortunately, they kind of are still interwoven in a way that is unnecessary and unfair and an inequity that has to be addressed. To bring it down to maybe sort of an everyday example in the workplace, also thinking about the title of the segment being Let's Talk About It. And one of the motivations around starting this segment being that one of the issues we see so much is that people in the workplace are actually, similarly to what we said before, willing to change and wanting to do things differently, but deeply afraid of saying the wrong thing or making a mistake, right? There's like this huge sense of dread that you might step on somebody's toes or do something wrong or offend somebody. And oftentimes what that leads to is people stay super silent and end up being even more exclusionary, not because of a malicious intent, not because they're trying to be mean, but because they're so afraid of doing something wrong that they're like paralyzed by this fear. And I could imagine if we think about people in a team, let's say we're in the office again, the pandemic is integrated, people have returned to the office, you have a team who's sort of going to lunch together and sharing about their recent travel experiences after the summer, right? That might be a situation in which I could imagine people who care about creating a sense of belonging and who might know that a person on their team is stateless and doesn't have a chance of freedom of movement, not really knowing what to say or how to interact with each other. Do you have a recommendation for people who find themselves in this kind of situation, how to address it?
Yes, so I'm just trying to be cautious about maybe not generalizing it too much, because this is how I see it currently. So I've had those conversations in teams I have worked in. And the thing is, in the case of statelessness, it is not that there is another individual group of human beings discriminating me. It rather feels like the government is this one part that just makes me powerless. And this is why I feel like conversations can be easier in that sense, because whenever there were colleagues talking about their vacation, I didn't really feel left out. So there might be cases in which I wasn't really able to share something. But at that time, I already had a travel document because I got that at the age of 18. So that was okay. But obviously, I didn't travel as much as other people did because I was just afraid oftentimes. I did work in a team in which we were often forced, that's how I felt, to travel, because we had an office in Munich and we had one in Hamburg. And those times were super uncomfortable for me because I always was scared about what might happen whenever my documents would be checked at the airport. And in those cases, a person that just is mindful of that, maybe just asking, do you need support with anything? Is there anything we could do, like document wise, that could support making sure that this travel goes smooth for you? I oftentimes, when my documents get checked, I am in a situation which it takes 5 times longer than for other people. So I have this queue behind me, making things extremely uncomfortable. I often feel as if it's being criminalized that I have a different document. And just imagining that situation, just making sure that whenever I return to the team after that uncomfortable situation, they just make it less uncomfortable by just showing me that I'm part of the team regardless of my documents, and that doesn't change anything about me. But so that's in that situation. But back to the conversation about vacation, maybe also just making sure to be aware that this is not a given. Just also asking the other person, like, so sorry that you're not able to go on vacation. Instead of asking, can you at some point maybe apply for a travel
Mhm.
document? Because those are the questions I hear very often. Instead of asking that, maybe just ask them what they do to relax. What do you do on your days off and so forth? Or maybe even depending on how close you are, maybe even ask where would you want to go if it was possible? Because of course it is painful, but then again, just thinking about just dreaming about those situations is then again something positive, right? Because it also kind of conveys that at some point it will be possible for that person and allows that person to share why they would want to go to that place, for example, and what do they actually connect with that place. Is there something they connect with that place? So it's hard, but I guess that the risk of hurting someone, at least in context to freedom of movement, is not as high as hurting somebody in context of the topic of belonging, national identity. Asking a stateless person where they are from, it is a no in any case. But in that case, this question is so twisted for somebody like me, I can't even begin to explain the different levels. So those are things that can be helpful. And also, I often get asked whether I feel German or whether I feel, German or something else. And it's just, it's okay for me. Meanwhile, it has become okay for me to just share my perspective and just also embrace my perspective because I wasn't sure oftentimes. But then again, for another person who doesn't work in that area, it's just exhausting, actually. It is exhausting. And that's something maybe to avoid. That was a long answer, sorry.
No, I think it's amazing. I kind of feel like I want to take notes and have a spreadsheet of sort of making these responses and these different ways of having conversations available, because I think it's so valuable to have these avenues and to explore these avenues of conversation, because I think what it does is it takes people out of being speechless as the people who, might be not sure how to ask questions or how to engage in conversation. But on the other hand, it actually brings people into conversation who might otherwise just be excluded from conversation, right? So it has the potential for positive effects for everybody, right? And I think you mentioned something really important here, in that we can find ways of talking to each other that show empathy and show opportunities to create empathy for each other, right? And I think sometimes that just means that we need to get into conversations that might be uncomfortable, especially as people who are not affected. And realizing that that's just part of the journey, the whole being uncomfortable, and knowing that everybody around us is in that with us as well. It almost feels like the situation you're describing at the airport of allowing people to land again after having a moment of harm, right? So kind of thinking about harm reduction in a sense.
That's true.
And creating belonging by understanding that harm will be done. This is inevitable, right? This is something that we cannot avoid. What we can do is understand and think about and plan for how to deal with each other in these moments of harm. And the suggestion you made of thinking about how to let a person feel like they are still part of a team after going through, hours sometimes of having to be stuck at the airport and being questioned there.
Yeah. And like now that we're talking about it, I'm just for the first time realizing that did have that situation once in a very great team. And that was after that situation where I tried to travel to Morocco and unfortunately got stuck at the airport for many hours. And I felt shame, such a high level of shame when returning, because so I was very close with the team, also with the leader, and I had shared with everyone in the, so I do talk to people and I'm probably rather more of an extrovert. So I shared that I was going on vacation because I was very much looking forward to it, because I don't do that so often. And then having to return back to Munich in less than or back to the office in just only a couple of hours, actually, it was super hard for me. And I was so ashamed because I knew that I would have to explain why I was back. And I remember that my boss, I don't even really know what he said actually, but the way the team just made me feel, it just made me realize that There is no reason to be ashamed. You don't have to be ashamed. This happened to you, but this was not your fault. You are still a human being, and people value you for who you are, regardless of the fact that you are stateless.
Yeah. I am human, right? I wonder what you would say to this. One of the ways in which I've learned to show empathy, especially in situations where I don't have that lived experience, I don't share that lived experience, is just saying, wow, that must be really hard. Like, I can imagine that that was a very challenging situation. Is there anything I can do? Or is there something that you need? Or how are you? How do those land for you?
They do land very positively. So I think especially the part about the how are you, in my specific case, because in the past tended to ignore my feelings around statelessness because I was just very much focused on not giving it too much space. So asking that question, even if I might not answer it in that instance, just allows me to also reflect on how I am feeling right now. In the case of this Morocco incident, I don't even know if I was aware of what I was feeling in that situation. I know it now looking back, but it was just I just felt very uncomfortable and very hurt, but I wasn't really able to put it into words. So asking how are you, and also showing empathy by just saying that it must be hard for a person, I think that's great. Other questions that go more into detail about how come you are stateless? How is this even possible? Can't you change it? This question actually, at some point, it even gets annoying because it seems as if people would doubt that a person who is affected by it wouldn't try anything possible to actually get out of that situation. And I get asked so many times whether there's something I could do about it, and obviously there's nothing. And that's one of the big things with statelessness. You're made powerless. You're not powerless, but you are made powerless to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And your hands are tied, and you at some point you just have to decide whether or not you want to put even more effort into it and fight even more, or whether you just try to deal with what you have and try to make the best of it until you actually do have the opportunity to do it in a way that presents less friction, obstacles, and barriers you would need to overcome in order to actually improve that situation.
Yeah. I also wonder if instead of asking you what you could change, it might be more helpful to ask what the person who's asking the question and clearly wanting to engage with it could do to support, right? To be an ally or to be an advocate and engage with.
That question is very tough, and I find myself thinking about it very often. So I think large scale, I at least feel, especially in the spaces in which I am, because I do have that privilege, I feel like the majority of the people I interact with at some point are in a position of power. And by that, I don't only mean like political power, right? But also power in terms of, for example, leading a company or providing a service and so forth. So just being aware of the fact that statelessness exists and making sure to include it into whatever you're doing, or at least question whether what you are maybe sharing with a broader audience, whether that is including people who don't have a nationality. So very simple example is, for example, in tech, everything's getting more and more digital, which I actually like. But then again, obviously, the things we know as human beings are simply being embedded into different algorithms. So if you don't know that statelessness exists, there are cases in which there are systems of, for example, to prove identity, right? So I had situations in which my document was not accepted by different services because they just simply didn't know what to do with it. And there are situations in which I want to book an Airbnb, but I can't prove that I'm a real person because they wouldn't accept my ID card. So in cases in which you at some point are in a position to decide something, offer something, create something, just question whether whatever you are offering is actually barrier free to people who don't have a nationality. In other cases, it is also educating yourself. So if you do work in the legal space, political space, civil society organizations, maybe your work intersects with migration or something similar, just make sure to be educated about statelessness, because statelessness is a global issue that occurs in every country. It can happen to any person of any gender identity, of any skin color, of any age. So for me, the group of stateless people is simply a depiction of our world. So whatever you do, at some point, it does affect somebody who is stateless, right? And just making sure to be aware that this exists and educating yourself, because I think by educating yourself, you would already find areas in which it might trigger a thought, right? It might trigger a idea and make you understand that, wow, this is something I could actually influence with the work I do, or this is maybe something I could share with somebody else who does some work in that area. And because, as already mentioned, the lack of knowledge, the lack of awareness are just actively impeding progress and change in that area.
Yeah. Now I want to say amen. Yeah. I feel like there's also really an opportunity here for people who are working in HR, for example, in an organization or in a position of leadership in an organization, to look at policies and processes that are in place inside of the workplace that might, again, be barriers for people who don't have a national identity, right? And therefore might not have access to a whole number of things, right? Like the question of, do I require people to go on business travel? Is that really necessary? Like starting there, but also thinking about people might have a challenge getting a phone contract or getting an apartment or setting up a bank account, right? Which is limiting people to even enter the workspace. And I love this idea of creating belonging by sort of workplaces becoming places of sanctuary. So this is a narrative or an idea, a metaphor, I guess, that we've started to work with at BMC a little bit. And it comes from, or it started sort of as a thought within Pride and looking at queer liberation and the idea of creating sanctuaries for people whose human rights are very much in question in a lot of states around the world, right? But I think it doesn't end there. There are things that are tied to governmental processes and national processes, but there is wiggle room for organizations to be as sort of sanctuary cities around the world are taking in refugees in a way that is sometimes more progressive than a larger nation, being sanctuaries, having sanctuary companies, if you will, be spaces that are more progressive and fostering belonging in a better and more sort of deeper way than larger society within the nation that you're a part of. So I love also this, what you just mentioned, the opportunity that when we are educating ourselves, we can have these kind of light bulb moments. And I think if we're guided by an idea of how do we create sanctuary with and for each other, then you don't have to have somebody else tell you, like, these are the 5 things that you can change within your HR policy, right? It'll come to you because you have that guiding principle.
Yeah. And thanks a lot for mentioning HR. There are some areas in my life which I just, at some point, I experienced those, and then I just forget it because I don't want to deal with them anymore. But yes, I always had issues with HR. Sounds like I had issues with the people working in that department. No, I didn't. But I always knew that as soon as I got a job, I would have an uncomfortable conversation with the HR manager, because, and that goes back to educating yourself, I had to then educate them on what was stated on my document. So I always had to explain why I didn't have the German nationality, although I was born in Germany. Then I always had to explain whether or not I even have a work allowance, which I did because I have a residence permit in Germany. And all of those things, they do intersect, but I feel like it would be the responsibility actually of the HR department to be aware of those things, because it might be that I don't know, right? So I could have those documents, and unfortunately, as a person who's affected, you have to put a lot of effort into understanding what are your opportunities and what are your rights, because there's nobody actually educating you on that. So, for example, even understanding that you're stateless, I didn't know the term statelessness until I turned 18. And that was because I read some document, I think the document that was sent to us with the travel documents. And prior to that, so when looking at my document or at my ID card, it's similar to an ID card, but it's not an ID card. The part about nationality, the word stateless was not on the document, but there was this XXX, which meant unclarified. And then there's XXA, which means state free. And stateless. But then try Googling XXA or XXX, and you will see how hard it is to understand what that means. So also educating yourself if you're part of an HR department is great, because just the feeling I get whenever I understand, even from a website, that people in that organization know about statelessness, I just feel respected actually and accepted right away. And I feel like those are the people who really put in effort in those things, right? And really want to make sure that it's barrier free. So yeah, HR department is really a very important point.
Yeah, and I think this is such a great thing that you're mentioning. Like, that's why we care about co-creating belonging, right? Like, the best gift that you can create is having such a sense of awareness and transparency and accountability visibly also to the outside world, that people who get in contact with you as a team, as an organization, as a community, as a company already feel like, hey, wow, okay, I can maybe take off one layer of the armor, or one layer of sort of the mask that I've put into place to fit into a society that was not designed for me, right? So if you are leading an HR department, I would encourage and invite you to go ahead and take this as sort of your nudge to look at statelessness. I love state freeness, by the way. Can we relabel this and make it state freeness? Like, the positive spin on it, I think is to me feels just incredible. So HR people, go ahead and educate yourself, and maybe also subscribe to the Statefree blog to stay up to date on things, and know that you can be a sanctuary at work and create a sanctuary at work, and it makes a real difference in people's lives. Talking about state-free versus stateless, I imagine this is an intentional word choice, but this is just me imagining. Was it one?
Yes, it was very intentional, and it was also something that just very easily actually popped into my mind. So I already had the idea for the platform. I wasn't sure how to call it, and then so I didn't really have to think long about it, and that is simply because one of the things I also like about statelessness is the term that is used, because the less in stateless and statelessness, it kind of already conveys this belief or this narrative that you or I, in that case, am missing something I should be having. And that's not true. I'm not missing anything. So I'm missing something that was invented in a sense, right? And that was created. But as a human being, I'm not missing anything that I would need to be valuable, as worthy as anybody else in this world. So I am without state in that sense. And I would like that less people at some point feel state free. The thing is, with free and freedom is something that stateless people oftentimes don't really feel. So this definitely is a vision. And just like coming back to the topic of freedom of movement, which almost no stateless person experiences. So it is a vision, but in some sense, it's also it is a statement about the fact that this doesn't have to be negative if we don't make it something negative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It doesn't have to be negative if we don't make it negative. Absolutely. I wonder if, people are wondering or thinking about this as like one more of many issues that they could be focusing on or educating themselves about, which I guess is true. But I was thinking, again, prepping for our call, and also just because I've been following your journey with Statefree, I was thinking about our current, place in time and history. And if we look at the IPCC report that was just released, again, look at the climate crisis, and know that there will invariably be huge movements, migratory movements around the globe. There will be nation states that will no longer exist because they will be underneath the ocean, right? And there will be shifts. There are shifts that are happening right this moment as we speak, right? Within nations and movements of people. And so I feel like it's almost an incredible sort of, it's an opportunity, but there is a sense of moral responsibility almost to be able to use this time to educate ourselves around this issue, because it's not going away, right?
No, it's not going away at all. And this is also why I'm very skeptical about this goal of ending statelessness, and because obviously the trend is rather increasing. And on the one hand, when thinking about how we will be dealing with those situations in the future, I think one of the main things is definitely to include the topic of statelessness in a way that it's not only about, so if we think about people who come from country X, that we also think about people who come from that country but were stateless already, right? So what happens to those people? So this is a way to maybe deal with it, but I feel like this is a way that it kind of administers like the status quo instead of really changing something. And I think what really needs to be changed is simply, we just need to have a very honest conversation about what nationality means to us. So what I feel like nationality is something that is based on a lot of ideologies, and those are reflected in the law. And at some point, we just need to reassess whether this is still valid and whether this is also still helpful. I do understand that if we look at it also from like historical context, nation states is something that started beginning of 19th century. Then we created citizenship, this construct of citizenship, so that we could say those people are part of this nation state. And there was a reason for that. And I guess that many reasons for that are still valid today. But we have also learned that there are people who just don't fit into that system. And at this point, I feel like it is creating a lot of friction again, instead of actually supporting us. And I do understand that one wants to create a certain group identity if it is about saying, hey, you are part of us. But I feel like currently it is turned around and it's more about saying you are not part of us. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it is now time to reassess what nationality means to us, because it doesn't reflect the fluidity of the world we're living in right now, and it won't help us. I do understand that we want to cling to the things that we know and understand, but it is counterproductive in my opinion, and we just really need to be honest about why we actually hold on to it so tightly, to find other ways for us to maybe fulfill those needs we might have, right? I don't really know because I'm affected by it. But if it really is about national security, like, okay, then let's just find other ways to make sure that our nation is safe. And if it is about culture, okay, then let's just make sure that we find other ways to make sure that our culture still has what it had at the core. Although I really don't believe that naturalization of a few stateless people would mean that this culture would change. I think it would maybe enrich the culture, but it wouldn't destroy it. And yeah, so this is how I think a future should look like, or at least this is how I think we could think about how the future should look like. But I guess we must include the fact that there are people who are stateless and that those people will also be affected by forced migration, and think about what we will be doing with those people.
Yeah. I wonder if maybe, so John Powell, who is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, and who is definitely one of my big teachers and the figures that shows up again and again in the work that I do. He talks about this idea of expanding the circle of human concern and coming to an understanding of a more expansive we. What you just said really reminded me of that, and this notion of what is the most expansive we in which every human being can feel a sense of belonging, right? Because I 100% agree with you. A human being is valid and worthy, period.
No.
There is no national identity connected to that to make that statement true. The statement is true because the person is human. And since we are already in a moment, we have the climate crisis on the one hand, and we need to reckon with it because there's absolutely nothing, there are things that we can't roll back, right? There are things that are not going to be stopped. But on the other hand, we also have a reckoning on a social level with white supremacy and with still the remains of colonialism and colonialist ideology. And I wonder if there isn't also an opportunity here, as we're bringing anti-rape trainings into companies and organizations, as we're reckoning with how white supremacy, it has pervaded so many areas of society. If there isn't also a way of understanding that pitting nations against each other and pitting national identities against each other is an expression of supremacy, the idea of supremacy, the idea of hierarchy, right?
Yeah, so many things I want to say right now. So for one, yes, so statelessness is often also referred to, or at least also, for example, the ISI, Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, often refers to statelessness or to nationality actually as a political weapon, because in the end, there's so many things, depending on the nation state you are in, there's so many things tied to having a nationality that it is used as a weapon against individuals, right? People can be deprived of their nationality if they, for example, act in a way that it is not according to what that government thinks a person who lives in France should act like. So it is a political weapon, and a lot of the things that are reflected in law in terms of citizenship kind of remind me of old ideologies. So for example, there's jus sanguinis and jus soli, right, in context of citizenship, which means on the one hand, you either get the citizenship by blood, meaning that you are born by parents who have that nationality already, or you can be born on the ground of a country and already have the right to a nationality of that country. And it makes a huge difference because, for example, for me, I was born in Germany, but I don't have the right to obtain a German nationality because my parents are not German. And there have been some adaptations made to that, but those are extremely restricted and very limited. So in the end, it makes one think that in Germany, we just want to make sure that only German people have German children. And then again, the thing with national identity, it's a very important point, because the thing is that nationality, unfortunately, can be something completely different than national identity, because in the end, I could identify with a nation, but whether or not I have the nationality of that nation state is not up to me. So that's the thing with nationality. It's not up to me to decide whether I belong to that country or not, but it's up to the government to decide that, and up to the nation state. So I kind of made a huge turn in regards to your question about white supremacy, but yes. So there are just all of those small things that just make it seem as if all of those things were created by a, maybe not, I don't want to say a group of people, but a certain mindset that just excludes a certain group. And if we look at the stateless population, the majority of the stateless population is part of minority groups. So that is not a coincidence. That's statistics, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've made this point several times throughout our conversation, and I think it's a really important one. It's a mindset, which also means that a mindset can be changed. Mindsets are malleable. Similarly to culture, culture changes. That is at the very core of culture, that it changes. And that can also mean that we together decide what is the more expansive idea of us that we can create, to go back to John Powell and this thought of what is a mindset of a more expansive we, right? Or in our language, or in my language, what is the most radically human way that we can imagine this expansive we? And what does it look like on a very practical level, right? Yes. So yeah, lots of food for thought there. I think. And definitely a long road ahead. And I'm sure that we could have hours of conversation, and should have hours of conversation around this. But one thing that I definitely want to not lose sight of, and just look at briefly with you, or ask you and talk to you about, is kind of coming back. You touched on it a little bit already in the beginning, but so many of these issues that we're talking about are heavy, because they affect so many fundamental human rights and fundamental ways in which we relate to each other throughout our life, right? And an experience that both you and I share is working as advocates and as activists in an area in which we are both affected. And you've said this before, that means that there is an additional kind of burden of this work that is draining and that is tiring emotionally, physically, and mentally. And it's something that you also described in the blog post about your experience in Morocco. So I know my experience, but I wonder from yours, what do you do to regenerate your energy as a person who is working in the space where she is also very much affected? So what is helpful to you?
I think one of the most important things, or two actually, has become to listen and observe myself and how I feel. Because even before thinking about how I actively regenerate and how I gain more or recreate actually my energy, I have noticed that I unconsciously kind of overlooked the signs my body and maybe also my mind were giving me. And I am now trying to become more aware of that. So I'm trying to actually stop and pause and listen to whether or not a certain conversation maybe was draining to me, or whether or not something was emotionally way more challenging than I had expected it to be in the beginning. Sometimes I have meetings in which, well, I feel like I don't need to prepare because it's a very common conversation, common in the sense that those are very basic questions about statelessness. And I feel like, okay, this is a meeting I could have after another one, or maybe I could have another one after that meeting. And then I have that conversation. And for some reason, because it was a different day, I was emotionally very much touched by it and also emotionally drained afterwards. And that's something I'm now trying to understand more actively. And then when becoming aware of the fact that I do need energy, I think one thing that is very important to me is just sustaining my energy, which means that I really make sure to stick to my routine. I love my routines. And I do a lot of sports. I'm a music junkie, so I consume music almost everywhere and every time. And those things are very important to me. I started meditating when the pandemic started, and this has become extremely important to me. Also, journaling has become extremely important to me. But also, and that's a very easy thing to do actually. And one thing that has become very important is sleeping, meaning taking a nap. So there was this one conversation, I don't remember, it was a panel maybe 6 months ago or so, in which I had a short intervention about Statefree and the work I do in that area. And for some reason, I think it was because of the empathy that the audience actually showed. I then felt empathy for myself, and I felt sorry for myself. Always seems so negative, right? But I think I tend to overlook how hard this actually is for me as a person. But then just this being mirrored to me made me emotional as well. And I was so exhausted afterwards that I just took a nap of 30 minutes. And I was just so healing after waking up. So this has become my go-to place, my couch behind me. So I might even take a nap after our conversation, although I don't feel that exhausted actually right now. I think it was a conversation that important and very honest, but it also felt empowering. So currently I just feel more positive actually. So that's a good thing. So I might not need a nap, but this is something I have found for myself, sleeping. And apart from that, just sticking to my routines, reading, and being surrounded by family and friends. I feel like there's nothing as grounding as being surrounded by the people who know you for who you are, regardless of what you're doing, what you're creating right now, the visions you're pursuing, and they just know you at the core. And that's something that just always gives me strength and energy.
Awesome. Yeah. I like this nudge for sleeping and taking a nap.
So important. Sleep is underrated, actually.
It is very underrated. And I recently described it to somebody as probably the most luxurious thing that I have experienced in the past year or so, is taking like an unencumbered nap without having to set an alarm or whatever, just taking a nap in the middle of the day. And it's so interesting because there is this kind of narrative of luxury, right, that has to do with vacations, for example, a privilege, and so many other things. And really, this experience of being able to regenerate by sleeping to me even feels more luxurious than anything else right now. So I can very much relate to this. Well, I'm really happy to hear that you are leaving this conversation with a sense of empowerment. I'm definitely leaving this conversation with a renewed sense of purpose as well, which for me is also something that is regenerative, definitely, to connect with a sense of purpose and feel like I'm part of a bigger movement for a more radically human world and future. So maybe before we close, going back to that 10-year-old version of you that we spoke to in the introduction and sort of closing the circle there, I wonder if I'm sure there's lots, but maybe there is one thing that yourself of today, or if you connect for a moment to your wise future older self, what would that wise part of you today or in the future like to tell 10-year-old Christiana?
If that's okay, I would maybe split the question. So, because I feel like, in a sense, my 10-year-old self was wiser than I am right now. Because she didn't think about nationality. She didn't care. Why would she, right? And I feel like she would ask me to just stop focusing on it too much. She would ask me to remind myself of who I am, and that this is not something I chose, but that was actually chosen for me. And if I look at my future self, I think that my future self would probably say to me that I should just stop fighting it, just let it go, and stop fighting it, just let it flow. Actually, not even let it go, but just let it flow. I guess that is because deep down, I just have this tendency of being suspicious or skeptical about things that just work out. I think that is because I'm just used to having to fight a lot and face certain challenges before I actually reach a certain goal. But maybe I should just embrace the things that work out. And I guess that Statefree might be something like that. I feel like I don't even have a choice. I don't really actively decide to do Statefree. It just happens to me. And I think my older future self would say or advise me to just embrace it.
What song would your older future self tell you to listen to right now to regenerate after this conversation?
That's a tough question. I'm not sure if probably my older self, would she still listen to the same music?
I don't know.
Something to dance, actually. Right now I should dance. I feel like I should dance. So maybe something super, to me at least, super old. Like maybe September. or celebration. Maybe celebration, right? From Kool and the Gang. Something
Awesome.
to just dance and let go.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, then I hope you follow your own advice. Have a dance break. Amazing. Thank you so much, Christiana. This was a great conversation. I'm super happy that we had a chance to talk today. This definitely felt like a courageous conversation. And I really hope that it will be an impulse for others to have similar or different courageous conversations on the topic of statelessness, national identity, freedom of movement, self-care, and other topics. So
thank you.
Let's dance after this call to Kool and the Gang. And yeah, make sure to follow Christiana and the great work that Statefree is doing, and follow along to the rest of the episodes of Let's Talk About It. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.